The entire ballroom went silent when the ruthless billionaire dropped to one knee in front of the single father everyone had been laughing at. For 3 terrifying seconds, nobody moved. The cameras stopped clicking. The wealthy guests who had spent the afternoon whispering cruel jokes stared as if they had just witnessed the impossible. Across the polished marble floor stood a tired father in a faded blue shirt, his small daughter clutching his hand, while the most feared businessman in the city looked at him with tears in his eyes. Nobody understood what had happened. Nobody knew that the joke meant to humiliate one man was about to change 2 broken lives forever. If you believe kindness can give people a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one with the greatest heart. The story began on a bright Tuesday morning when sunlight poured through the enormous glass windows of the Sterling Crown Hotel, turning the chandeliers into rivers of gold. It was the annual charity luncheon, an event where billionaires, celebrities, politicians, and business leaders gathered to donate money and quietly compete over who could appear the most generous. Among them was Cassian Vale, a 41-year-old billionaire whose name could move markets with a single decision. He was known throughout the city as ruthless, emotionless, and impossible to impress. Employees feared disappointing him, competitors feared facing him, and journalists had spent years trying to discover whether he had ever genuinely cared about anyone. Most had concluded that the answer was no. That morning, however, another man arrived at the hotel carrying something far more valuable than a designer suit. His name was Marcellus Reed, a 36-year-old single father who had spent the last 6 years raising his 8-year-old daughter, Sienna, alone. Marcellus worked 2 jobs. He repaired commercial air conditioning units during the day and drove delivery routes in the evening. His hands were rough from years of physical work, his shoes were worn, and the sleeves of his only decent shirt had been carefully ironed that morning. He had not wanted to attend the luncheon, but Sienna had been selected for a children's charity program connected to the event, and Marcellus refused to let her miss an opportunity simply because life had been difficult. When they entered the ballroom, Marcellus immediately felt every eye turn toward him. He tried not to notice. Sienna, however, noticed everything. She squeezed her father's hand and looked up at him with the quiet concern children sometimes have when they realize adults are being unkind. Marcellus smiled and told her without words that they were fine. He had learned to smile through embarrassment, exhaustion, unpaid bills, and nights when he quietly counted coins at the kitchen table while his daughter slept. Near the center of the ballroom, a group of young executives noticed him. They knew he was there as a guest of the charity, not as an important donor. One of them, Preston Armitage, made a cruel joke about the tired-looking father wearing a suit that clearly did not belong to him. Another laughed and said that perhaps the charity should pair Marcellus with someone equally desperate for attention. The laughter grew when someone jokingly suggested Cassian Vale. Everyone knew Cassian had been avoiding marriage for years. He had rejected countless introductions from wealthy families and had famously told one magazine that romance was an expensive distraction. So when the group announced, laughing, that they were going to introduce the billionaire to the single father as the luncheon's most ridiculous, perfect match, everyone expected Cassian to be furious at the insult. Instead, Cassian walked toward them. The laughter slowly died. Marcellus instinctively moved Sienna behind him. He expected a cold remark, perhaps an angry dismissal. Cassian stopped several feet away and looked directly at Marcellus. Then his eyes moved to the little girl hiding behind her father's arm. For a moment, something changed in his expression. It was so brief that most people missed it, but Marcellus did not. The billionaire looked at Sienna as though he had seen a ghost from another life. Then Cassian looked back at Marcellus and asked why he was carrying a child's backpack instead of leaving it with the event staff. Marcellus explained that Sienna did not like strangers touching her things. Cassian simply nodded and said that he understood. The people who had created the joke exchanged confused glances. They had expected anger. They had expected humiliation. Instead, Cassian pulled out the chair beside him and invited Marcellus and Sienna to sit at his table. For the next hour, something extraordinary happened. Cassian barely spoke to the wealthy executives who had been laughing earlier. Instead, he listened while Sienna excitedly described a school project involving a homemade solar system. He asked questions about the planets. He even remembered which one she said was her favorite. Marcellus watched in disbelief. He had heard all the stories about Cassian Vale. None of them matched the man sitting beside his daughter. Then came the moment that changed everything. During the charity presentation, the host announced that the organization needed funding for a new housing program for struggling single parents. The room applauded politely, and several wealthy donors pledged modest amounts. Then Cassian stood. Everyone expected him to make a businesslike announcement. Instead, he walked to the stage and said that he would personally fund the entire program for the next 5 years. The ballroom erupted in applause, but Cassian was not finished. He turned toward Marcellus and said that the decision had nothing to do with the joke the guests had made. He had watched Marcellus carefully throughout the afternoon and realized something he had forgotten in his own life: there were people who worked themselves to exhaustion without ever asking anyone for recognition. Then Cassian revealed the truth behind his reaction. Years earlier, his own mother had struggled alone after his father abandoned their family. She had worked multiple jobs, hidden overdue bills, and smiled every night so Cassian would never know how frightened she was. She died before Cassian became wealthy. For decades, he had convinced himself that money could never replace what he had lost, so he built walls around his heart instead. Seeing Marcellus with Sienna had broken one of those walls. Marcellus felt his throat tighten. He did not know what to say. He had spent years believing that wealthy people could never understand the fear of choosing between groceries and electricity. Yet Cassian understood something deeper. He understood what it meant to watch someone you love struggle and feel powerless to save them. But the story did not end with a donation. That evening, Cassian found Marcellus outside the hotel, where he was waiting for a bus because his car had broken down again. Sienna was asleep against her father's shoulder. Cassian offered to arrange a ride, but Marcellus refused. He had too much pride to accept charity for himself. Cassian smiled and told him that he was not offering charity. He was offering a job. Marcellus hesitated. Cassian explained that his foundation needed someone to oversee its new housing initiative because it required someone who actually understood what struggling families faced. He wanted Marcellus to lead the community outreach program. Marcellus thought it was another joke. Cassian assured him it was not. The job came with a salary Marcellus had never imagined earning, but what mattered most was that it allowed him to spend evenings with Sienna. For the first time in years, he could be a father without constantly calculating how many hours he needed to work to survive. Still, accepting the job was not easy. Marcellus worried that people would say he had been rescued by a billionaire. He worried that his daughter would grow up believing success meant waiting for someone rich to save you. Cassian understood the concern and made one thing clear: Marcellus was not being saved. He was being given a door, and he had earned the right to walk through it. Over the following months, Marcellus transformed the foundation. He visited shelters, spoke with single parents, listened to families, and created programs that provided affordable housing, childcare, job training, and emergency assistance. Cassian watched from a distance at first, but slowly became involved. The Ruthless Billionaire began attending community meetings. He learned children's names. He listened to mothers who had been ignored by executives for years. And something even more unexpected happened. Sienna began visiting Cassian's office after school. The little girl would sit at the enormous conference table doing her homework while Cassian worked. Sometimes she left drawings on his desk. Sometimes she asked him questions about why buildings were so tall. Cassian, who had once eaten every lunch alone in silence, began keeping crayons in his office. One afternoon, Marcellus arrived to find Cassian sitting on the floor beside Sienna, helping her build a cardboard model of the solar system. The sight nearly broke him. Cassian looked up and smiled awkwardly, as if embarrassed to be caught enjoying himself. Marcellus realized then that the charity luncheon had never really been about a joke. It had been about two men who had lost different pieces of themselves finding a reason to become human again. A year later, the housing project opened its first building. Hundreds of families received safe homes. At the opening ceremony, Marcellus stood beside Cassian while Sienna held a ribbon-cutting pair of scissors. The same people who had laughed at Marcellus a year earlier were now standing in line to shake his hand. Preston Armitage approached him quietly and apologized. Marcellus accepted the apology without anger. He had learned that forgiveness did not mean pretending the cruelty never happened. It meant refusing to let someone else's cruelty decide who you would become. Cassian stood nearby watching the father and daughter. For the first time in many years, his face carried no coldness. There was peace there. The joke that had been designed to humiliate a struggling single father had accidentally introduced two wounded people who needed each other in ways neither could have imagined. Marcellus had given Cassian something money could never buy, a reason to open his heart. Cassian had given Marcellus something charity never could, an opportunity to stand on his own feet and change the lives of people who were once just like him. And Sienna, with her small backpack and bright smile, had unknowingly become the bridge between them. Sometimes life changes in the strangest moments. Sometimes the person others laugh at is carrying more courage than everyone in the room combined. Sometimes a second chance does not arrive looking like a miracle. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a joke, a difficult conversation, an unexpected job, or a stranger who decides to listen. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes people deserve second chances, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Your support helps us continue telling stories about courage, kindness, family, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. Before you go, comment, "Kindness changes everything," if you believe one small act of kindness can change the direction of someone's entire life. Because in the end, the richest person in that ballroom was not the billionaire with millions in the bank. It was the father who had almost nothing but still had enough love to keep going. And the most powerful man in the room was not the one who controlled companies, fortunes, or empires. It was the man who finally learned that being strong did not mean having no heart. It meant having one, and finally being brave enough to use it.